Hi, this is John Morrow, publisher of Two Morrows, and this is my Mr. Media interview.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,300 of my previous celebrity interviews at MrMedia.com. That's MRmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Libsyn, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Mixcloud, Alexa Podcasts, Spreaker, SoundCloud, or Stitcher, and please follow me on Twitter and Facebook. And if you like the show, please tell the world with a 5-star review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. On today's show, I'll talk to John Morrow, publisher of Two Morrow's books and author of Kirby and Lee, Stuf Said, the complex genesis of the Marvel Universe, in its creator's own words. The book is about the war between comic book legends Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, co-creators of the Fantastic Four, Thor, the Hulk, the Avengers, and many more. Stick around. Marvel vs. DC has been the gold standard in comic book company wars for decades. Right behind it in comics' cultural importance is probably Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee, a never-ending font of bitterness between two of the key pillars of the Marvel Universe. Together they created the Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, Thor, and much more. But from very early on, Kirby and Lee sparred about credit for who did what. As editor, Lee always got the final word and took whatever credit he wanted. Usually that meant words by Lee, art by Kirby. It would be many years later that comics fans understood how misleading this was. In the Marvel style, the artist typically plotted a story, laid it out, and drew it. Lee came in later to write the narration and dialogue. Often, however, Kirby did that too, albeit mostly uncredited. John Morrow, who joins me today, took a side in the Titanic battle a quarter century ago when he began publishing a magazine called the Jack Kirby Collector. Today, he is also the man behind Tomorrow's Publishing, which just produced his new book, Kirby and Lee, Stuf Said, the complex genesis of the Marvel Universe in its creator's own words. I should also mention that John's company published the second edition of my biography, Will Eisner, A Spirited Life. This is his second time as a guest on Mr. Media. John Morrow, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Well, thanks, Bob. I appreciate you having me back again. I guess it's been about 5 years or so.
Yeah, and we both aged just beautifully.
Oh yeah, we don't want to pull out the old audio and video from what was it, 2014 and compare to now. We'll just leave things as they are.
Yes. But you look sharp, John. You're holding up pretty well considering your age.
Well, thank you. You as well, considering your advanced seniority in life as well.
Well, the good thing is people can't see me; they just have to imagine. So listen, your fascination with Jack Kirby obviously goes way back. So let's start there before we get too much into the book. Why Jack Kirby, and why has your fascination with him endured, both as a fan and as a businessman?
Well, I don't think anyone that's a comics fan would have any trouble understanding why I was fascinated with Jack Kirby. He's just the preeminent artist in the history of comics. He has an incredible, amazing art style and storytelling style that just really, really clicked with guys my age. I was about 15 when I first really discovered Kirby's art. Up to that point, I'd heard of him. I'd seen a little bit of his art, but I didn't really much care for it. It seemed like kind of cartoony and with square knees and fingers and things. But when I accidentally was forced to read an issue of Commandy, the Last Boy on Earth, I went into it hating it and came out of it a lifelong Kirby fan. But I had no idea at that point that I would be here one day talking to you about a new book that involved Jack Kirby, that I would have ended up publishing books and magazines about the history of comics and pop culture. It's just been kind of a funny whirlwind ride, but it all goes back to being 15 and discovering Jack Kirby for the first time.
Well, and I can. It's funny that you mentioned Commandy because that was the one Kirby DC book that I just loved. I mean, every time they bring it back for a spell, I pick it up. I loved it then. I always felt like we needed more of them. I never took to his Forever People or New Gods or even maybe Mr. Miracle. But that stuff just never appealed to me. But Commandy, by the way, are we saying it with an I or with an E?
Well, it's with an E. In the first issue, the young blonde kid runs into an old military bunker called Command D, like the letter D. and that's where he got his name, Command D.
Command
So
D.
I'm pretty sure that's the proper pronunciation of it.
All right, so we're on the same page with that because yeah, I'd still, if you gave me a treasury of those stories, I would drop what I was doing and sit down and read it. There was just something really compelling about that, the storytelling and the art. But it was interesting in reading Stuf Said, where you said that yeah, that this was your introduction. It wasn't the Marvel stuff of the '60s, which is where I came in. Um, uh, it was the DC stuff. So that must have been very interesting for you to go back and discover all that other stuff.
Oh, very much so, because I've always been a DC guy, first and foremost. I mean, I like the Marvel comics. I have a healthy respect for them. But my heart belongs to those early 70s DC books. And unlike you, Commandy, I enjoyed, but that's not my favorite Kirby work. My favorite Kirby work is Jack Kirby's Fourth World stuff, The New Gods, Forever People, Mr. Miracle, and especially that wonky Jimmy Olsen comic that Kirby did that had so many amazing characters and concepts in it. I still can go back and reread those issues any day of any year and get something out of it. So, but going backwards into the Marvel stuff, that I did have to work backwards into that. After I'd exhausted pretty much all of Kirby's DC stuff from the early to mid 70s, I knew Kirby had worked with Stan Lee doing amazing work in the 60s. I just wasn't really often exposed to it other than a few reprint books because I wasn't old enough to buy it off the stands when they were producing it in the 60s. So, slowly through back issue dealers and flea markets and things like that, I started discovering Fantastic Four and Thor, the Avengers, Captain America, things like that, and developed a really strong appreciation for that Marvel work. But I think I could approach this topic of Kirby and Lee a little more objectively because I wasn't quite as beholden to it as some people are. Now, if I had to do a book on Kirby's Fourth World or Commandy, I don't know if I could be quite as objective. That's a whole different story for me.
Yeah, for me, and I'm trying to think, how did I see? I think I started seeing it like age 5 or 6 in the mid '60s. My grandfather would take me into New York. I may have talked about this on other shows, but my grandfather would take me to New York and Port Authority, and on the way home from whatever we did, baseball games, whatever, he'd stop and I could pick up a couple of comics. And I always got Marvels. It was X-Men and Fantastic Four and Thor and stuff like that. And I didn't know until years later that what I saw as the Marvel Universe was the work of art, was the art and the work of Jack Kirby primarily. Those were the images. I mean, you realize later that okay, Stan wrote whatever Stan wrote, but the visuals of the Marvel Universe from the '60s, it was Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko as well. But really, the enduring image was always Jack Kirby's work.
Well, it was, and I mean, he set the Marvel House style in the '60s, and that even carried on into the '70s. I know when Lee and Kirby kind of went their separate ways in 1970, and Kirby moved over to DC Comics to do those books that I grew up enjoying so much. At that point, Marvel was still putting out more Kirby work through reprints than DC was putting out new Kirby work, and that was kind of an interesting little tidbit I came across as I was researching this book. So Marvel knew the value of Jack Kirby even after he'd left the company, and they tried everything they could to capitalize on all the hard work he'd done for them throughout the whole 1960s with Stan Lee.
I saw that how you noted that in the book, and you laid out all the titles: Marvel Superheroes, Marvel this, Marvel that, and it was fascinating. I hadn't thought about it at the time. I hadn't thought about it in all these years, but you actually lay out how many titles. They clearly wanted to keep making money off of Jack Kirby without having to pay him.
Well, absolutely. And you could try to make the assumption that publisher Martin Goodman at Marvel and the new ownership that it was taking over Marvel at that time, didn't look kindly upon their star artists going to their competitor, and maybe there was a little bit of a personal vendetta there. I don't know. Comics fans love, especially on Facebook, to bring up as many controversies as possible and get things stirred up. I've seen quite a bit on Facebook since the release of Stuf Said, and a few of them I'm not even going to honor by mentioning some of the crazy things some of the people have said. But overall, it's been a pretty healthy discussion. I think this book has sparked a lot of very interesting debate and very civilized debate of people that they appreciate the factual basis of this book, and that it gives a lot of people a lot of new meat to kind of chew on in this whole topic of who did what in the 60s and who took credit for what in the 60s, deservedly or undeservedly. So Yeah, I'm really enjoying seeing the feedback from this book. And I made a few little minor errors here and there. People are pointing out a few typos, things like that. That's always helpful too. And it kind of shows the helpful nature of the comics fandom community in general, that they're embracing this book, and for the vast majority of them, debating it positively, and really rallying around it to say, hey, give a great word of mouth and let people know that this is a book that's going to stand the test of time historically, and have a lot of factual information for years to come.
Well, before we go too much further into the book itself, a lot of people who watch or listen to Mr. Media are not necessarily comics fans. They're interested in different aspects of media or just a good conversation. And so I wonder if you'd take a minute and just kind of set up the two protagonists. And I know Steve Ditko is a part of this book as well. But talk a little bit about who Stan Lee was, who Jack Kirby was, what their interaction was. And if you want to throw Ditko in there as well, that's fine. Just so people have some sense, a basis for as we go forward and go a little more detailed.
Sure. Well, if you're not familiar with comics, you're probably familiar with the name Stan Lee. Stan has had cameos in virtually every movie based on Marvel Comics that's come out for the last decade at least, dating all the way back to the early Iron Man movies, the Avengers, Hulk, Thor, most recently Infinity War, and then Captain Marvel's coming up in just a few weeks, and then the sequel to Infinity War for Avengers is coming out in May, I think. So, they're still, I believe Stan even filmed a couple of cameos before he passed away back in December that haven't aired yet. So, but Stan was the vocal mouthpiece of Marvel Comics, and I don't mean that in any negative way whatsoever. He was a tireless promoter of Marvel Comics in the 1960s. From the very earliest releases of Marvel, when nobody cared about them, he was still out there, working hard, trying to get some publicity for the company. By about 1965, he was really getting a lot of traction with that, and became sort of the hip face of Marvel Comics in the 60s during the whole hippie generation. The youth culture, college students were starting to notice Marvel and the comics they were putting out, and ignoring those kind of boring DC comics with Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, and opting to go towards Spider-Man, the Hulk, Fantastic Four, and things like that. So Stan really milked that in a great way, promoted Marvel, and gave a great forum for a lot of creators, not just Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, but a lot of other great artists to kind of spread their wings and do their thing creatively, helping create the Marvel Universe. The downside to that is, with all the publicity Stan's garnered over the years, and his movie cameos and his interviews, the general public at large does think Stan Lee did this all by himself. I mean, I've even seen newspaper articles where they call Stan Lee an artist or a cartoonist. He was, to his credit, he was generally very quick to point out, oh, no, I didn't draw the things, but I did write them and I did create them. And Stan, to varying degrees, would say create or co-create, depending on which interview you're looking in, and that could lead to a little bit of confusion as well. But certainly Stan was, he was the PR guy for Marvel back then, and even up until his passing just a couple of months ago, a tireless promoter of Marvel and their characters. So, and he deserved a lot of credit for that. On the flip side, Jack Kirby was a little quieter. He worked at home. He was a freelancer basically his entire career, except for one small stretch that was not at Marvel Comics. He, dating all the way back to the 1940s, he co-created Captain America during World War II. Pioneered one innovation after another in comics, romance comics. He was involved in a lot of horror comics that did extremely well. He monster comics in the 50s, anti-communist comics in the 50s through a character named Fighting American. But he really started hitting his stride, I would say, in his peak in around 1961 at Marvel Comics, with the first issue of the Fantastic Four that he did in conjunction with Stan Lee. From that point, it was just one constant nonstop train ride for Kirby in popularity. He was always considered the artist in comics, but at that point he was nicknamed Jack King Kirby. He was the king of comics. He was the premier artist in comics. Everybody copied his style. Everybody followed his storytelling, and he just had a legion of fans for his work. But by nature of being a freelancer working at home, he wasn't in the public spotlight the way Stan Lee was. So while Stan was out promoting the company and getting a lot of public credit for it, Jack was behind the scenes doing the bulk of the creative work, depending on which strip it was on. And while getting a lot of creative fulfillment, not getting a lot of financial compensation, first of all, and not getting creator credit as well. And that eventually kind of brought things to a head around 1965, 66, and started straining the relationship between Lee and Kirby. The third main member of this, who's just a small part of my book, Steve Ditko, he's the co-creator of Spider-Man. Steve's maybe reclusive is not exactly the right word for him, but he tended to shun the public spotlight. And he didn't do a lot of public interviews, things like that. He didn't like being photographed. But he was a very idiosyncratic creator, made a lot of innovations in Spider-Man, and also created Doctor Strange, who you've seen in the Marvel movies recently. So he deserves a lot of credit for the success of Marvel. But overwhelmingly, it was Kirby was the main artist in the 60s at Marvel. And that's why, leading up to a big court battle that started in 2009 and finally was settled out of court in 2014, Kirby is now considered co-creator of most of the Marvel characters with Stan Lee now.
As Ditko finally got credit for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, I believe.
He did.
Right?
Yes.
And since you mentioned the suit, I was going to ask you about that. Just so we establish, you do have a little partisan status in this. I know you acknowledge it up front in the book. You talk about that you were an expert witness for, I guess, I'm assuming for the Kirby estate.
Yes, the Kirby's attorney asked me if I would consider being an expert witness for the case, and I agreed to do that, and that led to a very fascinating day being deposed by Marvel and Disney's attorney, and that really kind of helped spark a lot of my thinking that led to me producing this book.
Well, I was going to ask, can you take a minute and tell folks what that was like, and what expertise were they calling upon you for?
Mainly historical. After doing, at that point, about 20 years of documenting Kirby's life and career, I was a pretty knowledgeable historian on all aspects of Kirby and his production, not just at Marvel, which was the main point of the lawsuit, but going all the way back to the 1940s. As an expert witness, I was called upon to testify about, what I had learned over the years about Kirby's history and his work at Marvel. Pull out quotes, specific things that Kirby and Stan Lee and other people had said to add to the court record there. So I remember the first day you get sworn in for your deposition, and Disney Marvel's attorney reaches into this big briefcase thing and pulls out pretty much a full set of my magazine, the Jack Kirby Collector, and just kind of fans them out on the table as if this was like, I assume this was some kind of an intimidation tactic, like, hey, buddy, you get anything wrong, I'm going to pull this out and show you you're not telling the straight story here. So, the thing with that is, as a lifelong comics fan, I know my history much better than the attorney did, actually. And even in my deposition, there were many instances where I was correcting him. He would have dates wrong and things like that. So, maybe Marvel should have hired me as a consultant. I don't know. Things might have ended up different in that suit. Who knows? I don't know. That's a joke, Marvel. Just kidding.
I know the one time I've been called in as a witness in a case. It was one weekly newspaper publisher against another alternate weekly kind of thing, and I was called as a witness. I guess I was a witness for the defendant, and the other party was like questioning me on the stand. The lawyer, thinking that they were real smart and they were going to be dismissive of me. Oh, well, you don't really know about this, do you? You don't really know about that. And I said, well, no, that's true. Well, there you go. And then the defendant's attorney said, Bob, did you ever work for this other company? I said, well, no, but they tried to hire me away from where I was working at the time. And the other attorney was like, I'm sorry, what? It just established my credibility because they had tried to hire me. And it was just, So I know that experience can be very eye-opening. He lays out the magazines to let you know that he has your magazines. The reality is he probably never read them.
It may be. That's possible. The funny thing about that whole court case, it stems from copyright law, which allows freelancers, creators, to reclaim the rights to their work after a certain number of years have passed. And in 2009, that was the time period when they could file to reclaim, the family could file to reclaim Kirby's rights to any of this material that was produced from, I think it was from like 1961 to 65. So they did, and it happened to just coincide exactly when Disney was buying Marvel for $4 billion. So of course, Disney's coming into it like Marvel didn't have enough at stake. Disney's big deep pockets are involved now, and so of course they were going to fight this. They weren't going to chance losing rights to these properties that they just paid all this money for. So the interesting thing there was I'd been commissioned by Marvel to write introductions for several of their collections and things like that as well. So it was kind of odd that Marvel's attorneys trying to discredit me as not knowing what I'm talking about. At the same time, they'd commissioned me to write historical articles for their collections. So it is, when you get involved in a legal battle like that, it becomes a very strange thing. But that case drug on and on for 5 years. Finally, in 2014, after several losses from the Kirby in different battles throughout, it was looking like the Kirby's attorney had succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to agree to hear this, because it would have been a landmark copyright case. Literally, I think it was 2 days before the Supreme Court was going to announce if they were going to hear this case. I think Disney thought wiser of it and thought, we don't want to risk having a landmark ruling against us, and they decided to settle out of court with the Kirby family. I'm glad that worked out. Some people at the time were very disappointed. It's like, no, you should have gone to the mat and seen this all the way through. It's like, well, yeah, but at the same time, that was a long battle, and I think Kirby talked countlessly in interviews about all he wanted to do was make sure that his family was taken care of, and thanks to that out-of-court settlement, his family is taken care of, and he's finally getting co-credit for things. I think that was a very nice resolution of things, and that was a great day when they announced that the case was settled. It was a spectacular moment throughout comics fandom. Boy, my phone was ringing off the hook that day. We were all, so happy about the outcome. And at that point, we were all exhausted too. And I was like, what, this Stuf Said book idea, I'm setting this aside. I've had enough of this. It's settled. We don't need to worry about it anymore. So.
Well, and since then, there was another case. There was the Supergirl case with Siegel and Shuster, the Siegel and Shuster estates, right? They were trying to reclaim the rights to Supergirl, I believe, in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that they actually got ruled against, despite the similar situation. And now Disney is facing the clock on Mickey Mouse. The rights to Mickey Mouse are theoretically going to go into the public domain shortly. But no one believes
they were theoretically many years ago as well. And the Sonny Bono Act, when he was in Congress, got that passed and took care of that. So Disney had more years before it would happen. Who knows? I am no legal expert by any means. But yeah, it is fascinating, the various things. And the Kirbys lost several rulings along the way to that out-of-court settlement because Disney had much more expensive and many more attorneys to fight this with, and they got preferential jurisdictions to rule for them and things like that. And that's the way the legal system goes, unfortunately. But I think it was a happy ending. It worked out.
That's good.
To my satisfaction. Anyway.
I'm glad. I'm glad for them. So let's come back to the book. We've kind of laid the groundwork for people who don't know Marvel or Lee or Kirby or this kind of detail. Talk a little bit about the root concept behind the book and then the format of the book, which is unusual to say the least.
Sure. Well, after that court case was settled, I was done. I dropped the idea of doing this book, but after a couple of years, it was still nagging at me. And one thing that really stuck in my mind all those years, I'd read and researched all these interviews with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee over the years. And there were a few instances of things that just didn't seem consistent to me in what I thought the general recognized historical record was. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to resurrect this idea, and I'm going to really research the thing and put all of their quotes, their respective quotes about working together and creating or co-creating the characters into chronological order and really read what they said from 1961 up to the present and see if that helps get a little clarity on this, make a little more sense of it. And boy, did it ever. Seeing them comment on this as things went along, starting in the early 60s when there was no merchandising money at that point. I don't think Marvel was even selling T-shirts at that point. Up through the late 60s when Marvel was the hottest thing in comics anyway, and was looking at being bought out by a much larger corporation. And then all the way up to the 80s when you'd had the Hulk TV show with Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby in it, minor successes at the movie theater. And then, of course, the Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire came out, the X-Men movies, and now the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's so much on the line. You have to kind of give a different amount of weight to these later comments once there was more money involved, right? Because, it's just human nature. You've got you're bound to have other motives involved when there's that much money involved. I'm not trying to call people liars or things like that, and I make that clear in this book. But it's just human nature. You memories change over time. I know mine do, and I have to go back and document things to make sure I'm remembering what my kids did when they were 3 years old, as opposed to what I think they did when they were 3 years old. Same thing with Lee and Kirby. You've really got to go down and look at the historical record, and by putting them in chronological order, that helped immensely, because there were some things Jack Kirby said in a 1989 interview that at the time he sounded just a little off there. It sounded like he was just very old and bitter and was saying some really rough things that didn't match the perceived historical record that what the public thought. But going back now and researching it, he was alluding to a lot of those same things back in 1965, 66 in interviews then. He was doing a little more diplomatically then because he was still employed by Morrow at the point, and you don't want to rock the boat with your boss. But the information's there, and it lets you see how consistent or inconsistent he was throughout the years, and the same with Stan Lee. Stan, by nature of before Marvel got really popular, he seemed to be a little bit more giving in terms of saying co-credit. And particularly right after a big blow-up that he and Kirby had at the end of 65 and early 66. All of a sudden, Stan was seemed to be bending over backwards to really give Jack a lot of extra credit, incorporate him into interviews, let him be involved in interviews as a dual interview subject while he was being interviewed and things like that. It's a fascinating dynamic between the two of them, and two very, very different personalities, two different generations, really. I mean, they were about 10 years apart in age, something like that, and that made a big difference because Kirby fought in World War II. Stan was kind of on the sidelines during World War II and a little bit younger. Stan got his start working for Kirby as an assistant on the very earliest days of Marvel Comics. It was then called Timely Comics. And there's a lot of history between the two of them, and it all kind of comes into play over time. Now, in terms of the formatting of the book itself, I'm a graphic designer by trade, and I wanted to make sure that this book it's a very dense book with a lot of factual information. I wanted to make sure it was as clear and understandable and concise for people as possible. So I developed a little graphic technique in here. Originally, it was just going to be a black and white book, but once I got into it, it's like we really need color to help distinguish what Stan Lee's saying from what Jack Kirby's saying. So at a glance, you can immediately thumb through the book and see, wow, Stan Lee has 20, 30, 50 times more quotes in this book because they're all in red than Jack Kirby has because they're all in blue. And that helps to give a little balance to the book. It's like, you can say, how could I be objective if I'm doing a Jack Kirby book? But I'm giving Stan a lot more say throughout this book because he just, by nature of his position as the public face of Marvel, he made so many more interviews than Jack Kirby did. Stan's interviews also tended to be in a much wider public arena, TV, radio, newspapers, whereas Jack's were more low-key fanzines, things like that, small newsletters, the occasional newspaper article. But I don't know that Jack was ever on TV in the 60s, not once. He was on radio a couple of times, but generally in an interview, a co-interview with Stan. So that's the other interesting factor of it. By distinguishing, Stan's quotes are all in red, Kirby's are all in blue. It really helps you see, particularly if you're at the exact same junction in time, say, March 1966, you see what Stan Lee is saying that month versus what Jack Kirby is saying that month. And they don't always juxtapose very well against one another. The other trick here was making sure that I had a somewhat accurate timeline of what Kirby and Lee were working on every month from 1961 to 1970 especially. That was trickier than I thought going in, because the problem is you can't assume just because something was published in, say, March 1967 that Jack did it 2 months or 3 months before that. In some instances, he may have done it a year before, and it sat on a shelf and didn't get published for a while. So a lot of what he was working on in comics directly relates to what he and Stan are saying on a given month. I came up with after much deliberation, came up with a pretty accurate timeline, I think, of what material was being produced each month throughout the 60s. And, it may be off a month or two here or there, but it's close enough that I think we can make connections between what Lee and Kirby were both saying in interviews, juxtaposed against what we think they were working on at that time period.
So knowing that you've always been very supportive and a big fan of Kirby's, was there anything that you picked up in researching this and putting things together that surprised you that Jack said, or did Jack at any point acknowledge something that was diametrically opposed to what you believed was the case?
Hmm. Well, I think I sort of alluded to it before, but I'll kind of clarify. In that 1989 interview, he said some things that I remember at the time as a fan, long before I was publishing. I read that interview and went like, "Wow, Jack may have lost it here. That doesn't ring true. That doesn't sound right." And I remember having serious doubts about him. So what surprised me was that, wow, he was saying things in the mid 60s that validate those comments he was making in the 90s. That was the real surprise for me. I think on the flip side for Stan, I've always tried to give Stan the benefit of the doubt on this. And I think I still do, but there are a lot of instances when you lay it all out chronologically like I did for the book, where you see 64, 65, Stan says, "Oh yeah, Jack and I did this," and I don't remember who came up with the name for Galactus or the Silver Surfer, characters like that. Then around in the 80s and the 90s, Stan's like, "Oh yeah, when I came up with the name for Galactus and the Silver Surfer." Now, a lot of that is just smart promotion for Stan. You know, he was the company man. He was still on salary from Marvel as their chairman emeritus to promote their stuff. And there was also, you know, obviously a legal copyright reason to claim that stuff was done by the company employee, Stan Lee, and not by the freelancer, Jack Kirby, who might have a legal claim to that material since he wasn't a company employee. So you have to kind of weigh that as well. And some of those comparisons of earlier comments to later with Stan did surprise me as well, because you know, you hit things on that and you have to then question, okay, is that just Stan being forgetful, you know, or is that an intentional slight that he's doing for a legal reason? You know, is he just promoting his own legacy and not Kirby's, because Kirby's going around saying things not positive about Stan at that point? You know, every reader can kind of judge that for themselves, I think, when they read the book. But the real value in this book is reading it from cover to cover, chronologically, starting earliest to latest comments. Don't just jump right into the 1980s and read some comments and try and make sense of it. You really need the full context of their careers, both together and separately, to understand the full scope of the research that went into this book.
Do you ever feel that that I mean, Stan, because he took all this credit over the years, that he was this, he was that, but he never owned Marvel. He actually
No.
Up until a certain point, he continued to work for decades for Martin Goodman, who was a relative. I never remember if it's a cousin or an uncle or someone twice removed, but and everything I've ever read of Martin Goodman, he never comes across very well as a human being, as a businessman. And I sometimes wonder if Stan, and I don't mean to be defending Stan, he doesn't need me to defend him, but if that Stan, because he took so much credit for creating and doing so many things, that he naturally would have to take the heat for Marvel and Goodman's business practices and policies. He was out front, so he would have to defend those things, but maybe he wasn't always the bad guy in the situation.
Well, there's a human side to both Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and I also tried to include quotes from their respective spouses as well, because I think that adds a nice bit of humanity to humanize both these guys. I remember Lee's wife Joan in there is quoted talking about, no one will ever know all the times Stan went into the owner, Martin Goodman, and tried to cut a better deal for the artists to give them a little more per page rate. There's quotes in there from an artist, Herb Trimpe, who drew the Incredible Hulk for a good long period there, and talked about how he was having money troubles at one point in the late 60s, and he went to Stan, and Stan said, "Okay, let me go talk to Martin." And he came back, and he had a check for $800 that Martin Goodman signed to Herb Trimpe, a loan, no interest, to help him get through, and they just take it a little bit out of his pay each week till it was paid off. There's a human side there to Martin Goodman as well. There's a tendency to make him out to be this bad guy, and he did some very sneaky things as a businessman, particularly to Jack Kirby. But also he did some good things. So, Stan was beholden to Martin Goodman. And at the end of my book, I render sort of a verdict on what I think on there. It's kind of irrelevant to the book in general, because readers can read it and ignore my little 2-page verdict at the end if they like. It won't bother me a bit. I think there's enough information there. Everybody can make their own decision. But part of my verdict brings into question Martin Goodman and his business tactics, and how, if he had operated Marvel Comics differently, this whole dispute probably wouldn't ever have been an issue. So there's a weird dichotomy there with him. In some instances, he took very good care of his employees. In other ways, he didn't. I think you could say the same thing for Stan Lee. Stan stuck up for people when he could, sometimes only when it was expedient for him, but other times when it wasn't. He did have a very generous side. So I know personally my own dealings with Stan over the years, he was always very generous and very giving of his time if you want to interview him or just get a quick answer to a question, things like that. Right. So it's not as black and white as a lot of fans want it to be. And there's fans on both sides. There's Stan Lee fans that think Jack Kirby's a terrible person and just is, sour grapes. And there's fans on the Kirby side that think Stan Lee is the Antichrist and he went and took advantage of poor Jack Kirby all these years. It's just not that black and white. And I think reading this book, people will see that, you will probably come out of it feeling a little more toward one side or the other. But at the same time, I don't think you're going to go, there's a smoking gun. This person's terrible and this person's great. It's just not that cut and dried.
The book is like a dialogue. It's the back and forth. It puts comments that were said at different times in perspective against one another with events, and it's very interesting that way. One more question along the line of the Goodman stuff, but does Jack Kirby does he bear some personal responsibility for what befell him as in terms of the business part of comics? I mean, he was not, and I remember Will Eisner saying this, because Eisner, of course, is remembered as a great businessman. He had some very strong opinions about Jack not being a particularly smart businessman, or that was not his thing, and that Jack was not a timid man. I mean, he was he was a very muscular guy. He was known certainly in the 40s as the guy you didn't mess around with, and he certainly could have mopped the floor with skinny Stan Lee. But did he bear any responsibility for, maybe not standing up more for himself, or at some point just saying, I'm not doing any more for you guys, just walking away before he actually walked away? He endured, almost a decade of this.
He did. I will. The short answer to your question, yes, I think Jack Kirby bears some personal responsibility for not standing up for himself business-wise more than he did. But you've got to take that with a big, big grain of salt, because the deal was stacked against him from the start. He was going into a company who he already had a bad track record with from the early 40s, because Martin Goodman had cheated him and his then partner out of royalties on Captain America after they created it. So there was already that bad blood there, and knowing that you could not trust Martin Goodman in a business situation. Then to come back in the 60s, when really he didn't have any other options. There was an editor at DC Comics at that point, who was the only other main outlet for comics really at that point, who had it in for Kirby. So he couldn't go there and work. And so he was stuck at low-paying Marvel Comics, and out of that desperation actually came a lot of the great ideas. He knew he had to make sales, so he gave his all creatively to come up with a lot of these creations. So yes, he bears some responsibility, but at the same time, when you're in a dead-end situation and you don't have any other avenues to turn to, it's kind of hard to say, you should have gone in and told your boss off to get a better deal. And he did try, to his credit, over the years to get a better deal repeatedly, and was repeatedly turned down by Martin Goodman. You could say the same thing. Stan Lee, why didn't Stan stick up for Jack, right? He was the one that had the direct connection with Martin Goodman. Stan should have supported his top artist and top creator there and gone in and cut a better deal for him, right? You could make that argument. At the same time, I think Stan was a little more of the personality of looking out for number one. There's no crime in that. This is business. We like to think of comic books, it's so much fun, all these superheroes and things like that. But it is a business. It's a business, and it's take-home pay and supporting your family. It's a very tough situation. Now, when Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man, had finally had enough of working with Stan Lee and was not happy with the situation there, he did walk.
Right.
He showed up with his work one day, dropped it off, and said, I'm done, and left, and never came back. Never drew Spider-Man or Doctor Strange again after that point, despite everybody begging him to do just one more story. He never did. What we found out in researching this was also that at that point, he secretly went to Jack Kirby and said, Jack, walk with me. Let's stand in solidarity here. Let's show Martin Goodman that he needs us, and then maybe we can cut a better deal that way. And initially, Jack agreed to go along with that, But Steve Ditko was single and didn't have kids. Jack had a wife and at that point 3 kids to support. And he thought better of it. He just realized he couldn't risk losing his only source of income at that point. So he finally had to turn Steve Ditko down.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a really tough situation for Kirby. And being a family man, he had to support his kids. And, he couldn't just up and leave one day. And to start with, comics was not a great paying business in the 60s anyway. So if you burn bridges with your only main source of income, that's a nice noble thing to do, but sometimes you have to be more pragmatic. So,
well, before we wrap up, I wanted to come back all the way around and talk a little bit about the Jack Kirby Collector, the magazine you've been doing. This is the 25th year, right? You're celebrating 25
right.
years. That's part of why you published the book now when you did. How have you never run out of material?
Well, it's not that I haven't run out of material. It's Jack Kirby didn't run out of material. It just keeps popping up in the darndest places. Jack was such a prolific artist. He could draw, 3-4 pages a day easily, whereas most other artists could do one. Mm-hmm. There's unpublished work still out there, and we're actually publishing a special collection in October. This will be Jack's, as far as we know, Jack's final unpublished complete stories. We're compiling them all in a book. These are some stories he did for DC Comics in the early 70s, my favorite time period. Mm-hmm. And we worked out a deal with DC to allow us to compile these all into one book. It's called Jack Kirby's Dingbat Love, and it's some really fun, wonky stuff that he did for a couple of experimental romance books there. One was a African American romance magazine they were going to produce. This was during the era of Soul Train. And then also one called True Life Divorce, which was the anti-romance magazine about divorces. But also another two unpublished stories from a kid gang group called the Dingbats of Danger Street, which is a personal wonky favorite of mine. So, but that's the thing. Jack did all this work for so many years. He worked in comics for basically 50 years, and we're still finding unpublished work. We're finding unpublished sketches. We're finding unpublished interviews that he did. It's just this never-ending kind of wealth of Jack Kirby art and information. I started the Jack Kirby Collector in September of 1994. I'm going to be releasing issue 78, I think, in September of this year, 2019, if everything times out well. So, and no plans to stop. We've still got plenty. He had such a prolific career. There's still so much of his material to cover and to analyze. I'm kicking around ideas for similar books, sort of like Stuf Said, about different aspects of his career as well. So, I see no immediate end in sight. I've got another good 10, 15 years of work ahead of me, I think. So, and it's a lot of fun. It's, the guy was so amazingly talented, and his work is so satisfying to read. And I'm so glad I get to share that with people.
I think you made a really good point, and I was thinking about it before. Kirby was known for being able to turn out page after page after page. So you would think that because he was so prolific, he could have made a better living at it, which is probably why he was the kind of the face of Marvel style, Marvel House style. But you would think that would have made things easier for him because he could take on so much work and produce so much. But maybe Marvel felt they could pay him less because of that.
Well, Marvel, at least when Kirby started there, they had I think the lowest page rate in the industry at that point. And even when they got popular by the mid 60s, the artists in the book are even interviewed talking about, hey, we only got like $1 a page raise once in a while, something like that. Kirby probably had their top page rate, but even that, it wasn't anything great. And you just got to kind of take all that into consideration too. Kirby was doing this because he loved it, not because he was getting rich off of it. And I think it shows in the material. Jack put his heart and soul into everything he did. These concepts he came up with are just now starting to be mined in the mass media and the movies. And DC, if they ever get their cinematic universe in order, they've got a lot of material, a lot of Kirby material to work from there for their movies as well, if they can just kind of get their ducks in a row.
Very nice. Well, folks, listen, you can find John Morrow's latest book, Kirby and Lee, Stuf Said, the complex genesis of the Marvel Universe in its creator's own words, in great stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price MrMedia.com, mrmedia.com. If you are watching this video or listening on MrMedia.com, you'll see the cover of the book. You can click on it right now and go to Amazon.com. And I know what John is about to say, because he wants to say it, and that is you can go to Tomorrows.com, TWOMORROWS.com, and find the book there as well. Or were you going to say something else, John?
Oh, no, that was exactly what I was saying. You even spelled it correctly. Thank you, Bob.
I know this guy. And you can also go to the Tomorrow site and get the latest and back issues of the Jack Kirby Collector. So do that. Obviously, we gave the website, tomorrows.com with a TWO. Do you guys do any social media, Facebook?
We do. We do Facebook, Twitter, more Facebook than anything. We're old fans, so Facebook is for us old guys, or that's what my daughters tell me. Not so much on Instagram, nothing on Snapchat, but yeah, a lot of Facebook work. And sign up for our Yahoo mailing list. You keep updated on special editions we got coming out. We're about to actually do a special Kickstarter for our deluxe 25th anniversary book that's going to be all about the history of our company. So look for that soon on Kickstarter.
Very cool. Well, John Morrow, always a pleasure to talk to you. Great to have you back here, and continued good luck as you go forward.
Well, thank you, Bob, and keep up the great work on Mr. Media.
Turn your back on the deceiver. It's a bad idea to believe her. A bad idea to believe her. Turn up the stereo receiver. Turn up the stereo receiver.